The year is 1945. The Third Reich, once seemingly invincible, faces its final reckoning. In the frozen landscapes of Poland and Eastern Germany, millions of soldiers prepare for one of World War II's most decisive operations. This is the story of the Vistula-Oder Offensive, a massive Soviet military undertaking that would bring the Red Army to the doorstep of Berlin and signal the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Over just 3 weeks in January and February 1945, this single operation would reshape the war's outcome and alter Europe's political map forever. By December 1944, Nazi Germany faced an impossible situation. In the west, American and British forces advanced toward the Rhine. In the east, the Soviet Red Army stood poised to deliver the death blow. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses in Operation Bagration, losing entire army groups and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Desperate for a reprieve, German High Command launched the Ardennes Offensive in mid-December 1944, committing remaining reserves to a massive counterattack through Belgium. The gamble failed, exhausted German forces, and left the Eastern Front dangerously weakened. Stalin, however, refused to grant any respite. He launched preparations for the offensive that would carry Soviet armies across the Vistula River into the heart of German territory. Soviet mobilization was staggering. Over 2 million combat troops, supported by 6,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, concentrated in the area west of the Vistula. Soviet artillery parks included more than 14,000 guns and mortars, an incredible concentration of firepower that would create bombardments reshaping the landscape. Soviet planners allocated unlimited ammunition for this operation, understanding it would determine the war's outcome and shape the post-war world. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky commanded the 1st Belarusian Front, while Marshal Ivan Konev controlled the 1st Ukrainian Front to the south. Together, these two massive army groups represented the cutting edge of Soviet military power. Logistical preparations were equally impressive. Soviet quartermasters established supply depots and ammunition magazines stretching back hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. Railway engineers worked frantically to convert captured German rail lines to Soviet gauge. Truck convoys moved continuously, bringing forward fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement personnel to sustain the offensive. Before examining the offensive itself, we must acknowledge the tragedy that preceded it. When Soviet forces approached Warsaw in late July 1944, the Polish Home Army launched an uprising, hoping to liberate their capital before Soviet occupation became reality. The insurgents, commanded by General Tadeusz Komorowski, initially achieved success, capturing large sections of the city. However, Marshal Rokossovsky halted his forces at Praga, the eastern suburb across the Vistula River, without attempting to cross or provide meaningful support to the Polish insurgents. This controversial decision allowed German forces to brutally suppress the uprising. Over 200,000 Polish civilians were massacred in subsequent reprisals. The insurgents fought desperately for 63 days before surrendering on October 2, 1944. German demolition teams spent months systematically destroying Warsaw as punishment for the uprising. Over 85% of buildings were demolished in what historians describe as urbicide, the deliberate murder of a city. This tragedy would haunt Polish-Soviet relations for decades, but it also eliminated the strongest non-communist opposition to Soviet control in Poland. By the time Soviet forces finally launched their major offensive across the Vistula in January 1945, Polish resistance had been shattered, and Soviet political control over Poland was effectively assured. The ruins of Warsaw stood as testimony to the brutality of total war and the political calculations that shaped military operations. January 1945 brought bitter cold and heavy snow to Poland and Eastern Germany. Temperatures dropped to -20°C, creating treacherous conditions for military operations. Yet these harsh winter conditions would not delay the Soviet offensive. The Red Army had learned to operate effectively in extreme cold, while German troops, poorly equipped and suffering from frostbite, struggled to maintain combat effectiveness. On January 12, 1945, Soviet forces attacked in strength along the entire Vistula front. The offensive was preceded by one of the most devastating artillery bombardments of the entire war. More than 14,000 guns and mortars opened fire simultaneously, concentrating firepower on German defensive positions, command centers, and supply dumps. The bombardment continued for hours, creating a continuous wall of fire that German survivors described as apocalyptic. North of Warsaw, Marshal Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front launched multiple simultaneous assaults. The 47th Army, commanded by General Nikolai Chuikov, legendary for his defense of Stalingrad, attacked directly across the frozen Vistula. Engineer units worked under fire to establish bridgeheads while Soviet armor pushed through breakthroughs. South of Warsaw, Marshal Kohn's 1st Ukrainian Front launched massive attacks through Silesia. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, an elite formation commanded by General Pavel Rybalchenko, pushed forward with devastating speed. Soviet tank crews, trained in combined arms tactics integrating tank, infantry, and artillery support, overwhelmed German defenders who lacked the numbers and equipment to resist. By January 14, Soviet forces had achieved decisive breakthroughs across much of the front. German defensive lines, weakened by months of attrition and reinforcement diversions to the Western Front, simply collapsed. Armored spearheads raced westward with remarkable speed, covering 40, 50, even 60 kilometers in a single day as German resistance crumbled. Soviet forces executed massive encirclement operations designed to trap and destroy entire German formations. Army Group Vistula, recognizing that its positions were untenable, ordered retreats to prepared defensive lines further west. However, these defensive lines often did not exist or were so poorly constructed they provided little meaningful resistance. On January 17, 1945, Soviet forces fighting through Warsaw's devastated ruins encountered only scattered German brigade units. The 1st Polish Army, fighting alongside Soviet forces, raised the Polish flag over the city center, marking Warsaw's official liberation. However, the Warsaw liberated bore no resemblance to the vibrant metropolis that had existed before the war. Soviet engineers immediately began critical missions, constructing bridges across the Vistula under German fire. Major Boris Kuznetsov's engineer battalion built 3 bridges in 48 hours during the January offensive, enabling continuous reinforcement and establishing secure supply routes. Soviet reconnaissance units mapped safe routes through the devastated city, clearing mines and unexploded ordnance. Following the breakthrough and capture of Warsaw, Soviet forces entered a phase of rapid exploitation. Tank and mechanized corps smashed through German defensive positions while supporting rifle divisions followed in trucks and on foot. Artillery units moved on self-propelled carriages, remaining in close support. Soviet aircraft, operating from advancing airfields, provided close air support and reconnaissance. Soviet combined arms tactics proved devastatingly effective. Tank and mechanized corps provided the spearhead, while supporting rifle divisions consolidated gains and established new positions. This aggressive maneuver warfare demonstrated the sophistication of Soviet military operations by 1945. Marshal Kohn's forces in the south moved to secure Silesia, one of Nazi Germany's most important industrial regions. Soviet commanders recognized that control of Silesia would provide valuable economic resources for the post-war Soviet state. As armored spearheads advanced hundreds of kilometers, they extended supply lines stretching back through Poland into Soviet territory. Soviet railway engineers worked continuously to restore captured infrastructure, converting German gauge tracks to Soviet standards. Truck convoys moved along hastily constructed routes, delivering supplies forward while evacuating wounded rearward. By late January 1945, leading Soviet mechanized formations approached the Oder River, the final major obstacle before Berlin. German defenders attempted to establish defensive positions along the river, but the speed of the Soviet advance allowed them little time to prepare meaningful defenses. Soviet forces reaching the Oder found that German forces had established only partial defensive lines. By February 1, 1945, Soviet forces controlled significant bridgeheads across the Oder River, bringing the Red Army within 65 kilometers of Berlin. The Vistula-Oder offensive, lasting only about 3 weeks, had achieved objectives that military analysts predicted would require months of fighting. Soviet armor dominance was built on sophisticated combined arms tactics integrating armor, infantry, artillery, and air power. Soviet T-34 and T-85 tanks, though not individually superior to German Panthers and Tigers, operated in massive formations under centralized control, achieving overwhelming firepower at critical points. Soviet artillery achieved absolute dominance during the offensive. The unprecedented concentration of more than 14,000 guns enabled saturation bombardments of any German position. German artillery, by contrast, operated under severe ammunition shortages, unable to provide the continuous suppressive fires German defenders needed. Soviet gunners had developed sophisticated techniques for rapid fire concentration, enabling swift shifts between targets with minimal delay. This capability, combined with the sheer number of available guns, gave Soviet commanders overwhelming firepower support. Soviet air power, though inferior to Western air forces, played a meaningful role providing reconnaissance, close support, and limited air defense. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and pilot losses, offered only token resistance. German fighters, husbanded for critical air defense missions, were rarely available for ground support. The Vistula-Oder offensive, despite its spectacular success, cost the Red Army significant casualties. Soviet forces suffered approximately 400,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. This tremendous price reflected the intensity of combat, particularly in urban areas like Warsaw where Soviet forces had to clear German defenders from heavily damaged buildings. However, Soviet military doctrine accepted high casualty rates as the price of maintaining offensive momentum. Soviet commanders understood that allowing the offensive to slow would permit German forces to reorganize, ultimately costing more Soviet lives in prolonged fighting. German resistance, though increasingly desperate, proved insufficient to stop the Soviet advance. German divisions defending Warsaw, though offering fierce resistance, were overwhelmed by Soviet numerical superiority. Some German formations managed to withdraw in good order, but they could not stop the relentless Soviet advance. Polish civilians caught between German and Soviet forces faced terror from both sides. Soviet forces, though generally more disciplined by 1945 than in earlier operations, nonetheless committed acts of violence. German civilians in territories conquered by Soviet forces also suffered tremendous casualties. Entire German populations were expelled from their ancestral lands and forced to migrate westward into the shrunken post-war German state. The Vistula-Oder offensive must be understood as more than a military operation. It was an integral element of Stalin's strategic vision for the post-war world. By January 1945, Stalin understood that Soviet forces would play the decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany, and he was determined that the Soviet Union would shape the post-war settlement. Stalin's primary objective was establishing a Soviet security perimeter consisting of buffer states under Soviet political control. Poland, lying directly on the route to Berlin, was particularly important. By ensuring that Soviet forces liberated Polish territory before Western allies could participate, Stalin effectively established Soviet political control over Poland's future. The deliberate failure to support the Warsaw Uprising in summer 1944, followed by the rapid Soviet advance in January 1945, represented a calculated strategy to eliminate Polish non-communist resistance while establishing Soviet military and political dominance. This strategy, though morally reprehensible from the perspective of Polish independence, was completely consistent with Stalin's overall objectives for Eastern Europe. Western allies viewed Soviet advances with considerable concern. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill harbored deep suspicions about Soviet intentions. American President Franklin Roosevelt remained somewhat more optimistic about post-war cooperation, but even he was troubled by Soviet behavior in Poland and Eastern Europe. However, the Allies faced a strategic dilemma. Soviet forces were bearing the main burden of fighting against Germany, and the Allies could not afford to alienate their most powerful ally while the war continued. Therefore, despite considerable concern about Soviet intentions, Western leaders were forced to accept Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe as the price of continued Soviet participation in the war effort. The Vistula-Oder offensive of January-February 1945 represented a decisive moment in World War II history. In just 3 weeks, Soviet forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, bringing the Red Army to within striking distance of Berlin. The offensive demonstrated Soviet military superiority in every dimension: numbers of troops, armor, artillery, and air power. This operation opened the final chapter of World War II in Europe. With Soviet forces now within 65 kilometers of Berlin, the final defeat of Nazi Germany was merely a matter of time. No German defensive strategy could reverse the tide of Soviet military superiority. The only questions remaining were whether the war would continue for months or merely weeks. The Vistula-Oder offensive also predetermined the political shape of post-war Europe. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Soviet forces occupied the entire region from Berlin to the Soviet border. Stalin had effectively secured his sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The Cold War, in many respects, was already determined by the military and political realities of the Vistula-Oder offensive. The offensive became commemorated differently in Soviet and Polish national traditions. Soviet accounts emphasized the military skill and determination of the Red Army. Polish commemorations focused on the ambiguous nature of Soviet liberation: freedom from German rule but subjugation to Soviet domination. This tension between gratitude for liberation and resentment of Soviet occupation has characterized Polish-Soviet relations to the present day. Warsaw's reconstruction represents both a triumph of human resilience and a reminder that some wounds, though covered over, never truly heal. The Vistula-Oder offensive stands as testament to the power of military might, the complexity of political calculations in warfare, and the devastating human cost when strategy serves political aims above humanitarian concerns.